Hi guys, my name's George Agombar and I'm here today with Musiciangoods TV, the place to go for all things music production. Today we're going to be looking at the 5 chord progressions that every producer should know. These are some really common progressions that we see being used in music, and they're pretty much guaranteed to sound good. They'll get you started on any track you're working on and give your music a really solid foundation. We're also going to be having a look at what we can do to adapt and individualize these chord progressions a bit more as well later on in the video. But first, I think that it's important to just touch up on a bit of theory about chords and chord progressions. Now, if you don't feel like you need this recap, then feel free to skip ahead, and there should be time markers below to help you do so. So let's get into it. A chord is a group of multiple notes that sound at the same time. Normally in a chord we have 3 notes, and they're separated from each other by either 3 or 4 semitones, depending on whether the chord's major, minor or diminished. Every chord has a root note, which is the starting note of the chord. We start on this root note and then add the other notes on top. So if we take the root note G, we'd add a B on top and a D on top of that, and get a G major chord like this. But how do we know which chords to choose and use? Well, in every key there are 7 chords. So in G major, for every note of the G major scale, there's a corresponding chord. And where this chord sits in the scale, where its position is, will determine on whether it's a major, minor or diminished chord. And it's always the same. So here's how it works. The first chord is G major, then A minor, then B minor, C, D, E minor and F diminished. And each chord in the key is assigned a number. The root note chord is always called chord 1. So in G major, the chord G will be chord 1. You then simply count up in alphabetical order. A minor is chord 2, B minor is chord 3, and so on. And these numbers are traditionally written in Roman numerals. So basically, in our tracks, we can choose from any of the 7 chords in the key of the song. But when you listen to a song or you listen to a track, you very, very rarely hear just one chord being played. That would be extremely dull. Instead, we hear lots of chords being played in succession, and this is what we call a chord progression. But how do you choose the order of the chords? Can you just select them at random? I mean, you can, there is nothing stopping you. For example, if I played all the chords in order, it would sound a bit like this in G major. As you can hear, that didn't sound too nice. It wasn't great. But luckily for us, there are some progressions that we already know work, that we already know sound good, and that are already used in lots of different songs and lots of different genres, which we're going to get to in a minute. So, as we've said, there are 7 chords that we can choose from in the key. But are all chords equal? Definitely not. There are definitely some chords that are used much more commonly in music, which you'll see very clearly when we have a look at the progressions. We have 2 types of chords, primary chords and secondary chords. Now, we could get into all the theory behind it, however we could be here for days if we do that. So for this video, all you need to know is that the primary chords are chords 1, 4 and 5, and they sound the strongest as they help confirm the key of the song. The secondary chords are chords 2, 3, 6 and 7, and these sound weaker as they don't help confirm the key of the song. And so the 4 main chords that are used in progressions that you'll see throughout the next 5 progressions that we're going to talk about are chords 1, 4, 5 and 6. So bearing all that in mind, let's have a look at the 5 chord progressions that every producer should know. The first progression is what I like to call the pop progression, and that's because it's in so much pop music. And it's possibly the most common progression that you'll see being used in Western music. It's a 1, 5, 6, 4 progression. So in G major, that would be G, D, E minor, C. And here's how it sounds. And if you wanted to make it sound a bit more pop, perhaps you'd play it like this. What I think has made this progression so popular and effective is the fact that it's exciting. Every chord that's played sounds fresh and new. This is because the middle chords D and E minor are next to each other. This means that they don't share any of the same notes, which gives the listener brand new harmonic content effectively. Popular songs that have used these chords are Love Story by Taylor Swift, Someone Like You by Adele, Don't Stop Believing by Journey, and Let It Be by the Beatles. And honestly, I could go on and on for days with examples. So basically, it's just a really great progression to know and use in your music. The second progression is the blues progression. It's a bit longer, but really important. And that's because it makes up the 12-bar blues, which we all know is really significant in musical history. It's a 1-4-1-5-4-1 progression. So in G major, that would be G, C, G, D, C, G. And here's how it sounds. And in a bit more of a 12-bar blues fashion, it would sound like this. This is one of the most harmonically stable progressions that we have in music. And that's because it's based entirely on those primary chords, which are really strong chords and help us confirm the key of the song that we're in. For example, for this progression being used, you can pretty much listen to any 12-bar blues song, so perhaps Johnny B. Good or Crossroads. And you can see it being used in rock and roll, like in Hound Dog by Elvis, and even some country songs, like Folsom Prison Blues by Johnny Cash. It's really everywhere, and so it's a really good progression to know and be aware of. The third progression I call the doo-wop progression, and that's because it was pretty popular around the 1950s when doo-wop music was around. It's a 1-6-4-5 progression, so in G major, that would be G, E minor, C, D, and here's how it sounds. And now in a bit of a more doo-wop fashion. As I said, this was a very popular chord progression in the 1950s and used in a lot of doo-wop music. But we also see it used quite a lot today. Some great examples of this progression is Stand By Me by Benny King, Baby by Justin Bieber, and even in Friday by Rebecca Black. The fourth progression I've named the sad progression. It's a 6-4-1-5. So in G major, that's E minor, C, G, D. It's known to give us a slightly sadder and darker feel, but I'll let you judge that for yourself. Here's how it sounds. And now let's play it in a slightly sadder fashion. I personally think that this progression sounds a bit sadder and a bit darker and a bit more solemn because it starts on a minor chord, which really sets the tone for the music. Great examples of this progression are in Cheap Thrills by Sia, Africa by Toto, and Zombie by the Cranberries. The fifth and final progression is a very popular jazz progression, and it's only 3 chords. It's a 2-5-1. So in G major, that would be A minor, D, G. Let's hear how it sounds. Now let's jazz it up a bit. You can hear instantly that this progression sounded different to the other four, and that's because of the introduction of a brand new chord, chord 2, which is the chord of the supertonic. And this really is a backbone progression to a lot of jazz music. And you may be sitting there watching this video and thinking, well, actually jazz music isn't really too relevant to me. I don't really do much jazz. But actually, a lot of R&B music is also influenced by jazz. And so effectively, this chord progression is also used in a lot of R&B. Some examples of a 2-5-1 progression in music would be Tune Up by Miles Davis, Count Your Blessings by Kanye West, and you can even find it in some more mainstream stuff like Change the World by Eric Clapton. And a really great R&B example of this progression, which is a slight variation on the progression admittedly, is in On My Mind by George Smith. It's a 2-4-1-5 progression, and here's how it sounds. As you can hear, it's similar, but not exactly the same. So you just need to remember and bear in mind that R&B is influenced by jazz. Okay, so there are 5 chord progressions that I think you ought to know, and that's because it gives you the widest variety and they're very commonly used progressions. But if every musician and every producer is using the exact same progression, why doesn't all music sound the same? How can we begin to add variety and our own spin on these progressions? Well, firstly, a song may use the same progression as another song, but sound completely different because they're written in different keys. So I'm going to take the 6-4-1-5 progression and firstly play it in G and then in C, and we'll see how these sound different. I am also quickly going to say that I'm going to resolve the chord progression by playing chord 1, or a G major chord at the end of it, just because to me as a musician it sounds a lot nicer and makes me a lot happier than leaving the progression unresolved. So here's the progression in G. And now here it is in C. Although both these examples were technically identical in the chords that I played relative to the key, they sounded completely different because they were in different keys. Another way we can change up the sound of a chord progression is to invert some of the chords. When we invert a chord, we change the bass note of the chord. We basically rearrange the order of the notes. So a normal G chord is a G on the bottom, then a B, and then a D. An inverted version of this chord would have the B on the bottom, the D on top of that, and the G on the very top. So instead of sounding like this, it now sounds like this. And it's changed the sound of the chord completely, so it will change the sound of the chord progression too. Let's again use the 6-4-1-5 progression in G and invert the very last chord, the D chord. Here's how the progression sounds without the inversion. And now here's how it sounds with the inversion. And although the beginning of the progression in each example sounded identical, the end of the second example with the inversion completely transformed the progression. A final way to make your progression sound a bit more different and a bit more unique is to either use suspended notes or added notes. A suspended note is when you have a non-chord note in your chord, and an added note does what it says on the tin. It's when you add an extra note into your chord. There really is a lot of theory behind suspensions and added notes, and there are so many different ways you can use them, so I would really recommend reading up about them and doing a bit of research to get the best results. So again, let's use the 6-4-1-5 progression in G. So instead of E minor, we're going to hear E minor 7. And the note that we've added to that E minor is a D. Instead of C, we're going to hear C add 9. And again, the extra note in that chord is the note of D. So here's how the progression sounds without the suspension and without the added note. And now here's how it sounds with the suspension and added note. Technically, the exact same chord progression, but miles apart in the way that they sound and the emotion they convey. Just as a fun little fact and little side note, most musicians will refer to the 4 chords that are used in the final progression as the Wonderwall chords. They're really common and really are a backbone of modern popular music. So let's quickly recap the 5 chord progressions that every producer should know. Number 1, the pop progression, a 1-5-6-4. Number 2, the blues progression, a 1-4-1-5-4-1. Number 3, the doo-wop progression, a 1-6-4-5. Number 4, the sad progression, a 6-4-1-5. And finally, number 5, the jazz progression, a 2-5-1. These are the 5 chord progressions that I think every producer should know. I think that any one of these progressions is a really great starting point for writing and producing. But please don't forget about the ways that you can adapt them. And remember that these are guidelines, not strict rules. You don't just have to use one progression throughout the whole song. You can chop and change progressions. You can add chords to the progressions and change the order. It's really up to you. And that's what's so great about music and about producing. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Like and comment below, letting us know what you'd like to see in the future as well. My name's George Agombar. You can find me on socials at George Agombar and on YouTube at Third Fret.